thank you all for coming to our special session today. This meeting and the chat messages that go with it will be recorded, and the link will be posted on our website, mopag.net. That's mopag.net. There are other links of interest that have been posted at the top of the chat page. Our meeting today is in two parts. Nicole Galloway will speak on a new way for Missouri, and she will be followed by our panel on progressive capitalism. In both instances, we should have time for audience questions, which you can submit by using your chat control at the bottom of your screen. We are very pleased that State Auditor and Democratic candidate for governor, Nicole Galloway, has joined us today. Nicole earned her MBA at Mizzou and became a licensed CPA before going on to serve as Boone County's treasurer. She was appointed as state auditor in 2015 and won election to that office in 2018. She advocates a new way agenda to meet the needs of Missourians that changes how Jeff City works, and most importantly, changes who it works for. Nicole lives in Columbia with her husband, John, and her 3 young sons. On behalf of our organization, I'd like to welcome Nicole Galloway.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you all this afternoon. I'm so glad that even in the world of COVID, we still find ways to come together and interact with folks and talk about the issues that you care about. As Steve said, as you know, I am running for governor, and I am running for governor to put Jefferson City back on the side of working families. Because for far too long, the well-connected insiders have made deals in back rooms to get what they want while working families struggle. And I'm out to change that. Electing strong leaders who are engaged and responsive to the needs of all Missourians truly matters. And never before has it been so clear that the decisions our governors make have such a dramatic impact on our day-to-day lives, especially in times of crisis. I mean, as you know, our state is dealing with so many challenges right now. A pandemic that has disproportionately impacted our most vulnerable communities, an economy that is leaving too many Missourians behind, and a state government that cares more about what political insiders want than the urgent needs of our communities, our small businesses, and our families. We are still very much in the middle of a public health crisis and staring down a long road to recovery and facing tough conversations about how to make our society more just. We have to dig our way out of this. We need to help people get back to work, help people stay in their homes, help people afford their most basic expenses, help people feel safe. And I am concerned that for Missourians recovering from the crisis, it will be harder here in Missouri than in neighboring states. Not because the virus has hit us harder, but because Governor Parson's actions in the years leading up to the virus put so many Missourians right on the edge economically. And now the virus has pushed them over that edge, so deep into an economic black hole, it's going to take years to get out of. You might know, some of you on this call might know, that access to health care is one of the most important determinants of upward mobility and economic success for working families. And of course, during an infectious disease pandemic, it can mean the difference between life and death. But Governor Parson just doesn't get it. In parts of our state, you have to travel hundreds of miles for critical care because 7 rural hospitals have closed over the last several years. They went broke because the number of uninsured patients seeking care kept rising. It didn't have to be this way. And this year, we are going to do something about it. We are finally going to expand Medicaid and bring our tax dollars home to invest in our people, giving coverage to working people, saving healthcare jobs, and creating new ones in parts of our state that desperately need them. And for our children, we're going to make sure that they have the healthcare they need. But as we have seen, Governor Parson has a track record of thinking he knows better than the voters. I believe that if he is elected, Governor Parson will undermine our vote in favor of Medicaid expansion. We can let history be our guide on this. on Clean Missouri, on Right to Work, Governor Parson over and over again has looked at you in the eye and told you that he knows better than you. So when you vote to expand Medicaid, you better believe it matters who is sitting in the governor's office next year when it comes time to implement it. But first, we have to have access to the ballot. And just a few weeks ago, before our June elections across Missouri, Governor Parson actually went out and told people not to go vote. He said it while a bill providing a partial expansion of absentee vote by mail was sitting on his desk waiting his signature. He doesn't want you to vote, and the reasons are perfectly clear. He knows that when our voice is heard at the ballot box, we are able to seize control of our own futures from the insiders that have the power in Jefferson City. But in Missouri, we don't even make it easy to vote under normal circumstances, let alone during a pandemic. And if there is anything we have learned from this, it's that Missouri needs no excuse absentee vote by mail, needs early voting, and finally needs to end notary requirements. Governor Parson opposes that, I'll fight for it. This virus, our recovery from it, it will be the defining issue of our time. The most important thing the next governor will do is rebuild Missouri's economy. The question is, will we build it in a way that helps working people get back on their feet? Or will we rebuild it focusing on helping wealthy people and big corporations profit more? No politician created the coronavirus, but years of failed leadership has left Missouri's economy farther behind than it needs to be. As governor, I'll reimagine how we incentivize private sector job growth, focusing on small businesses, startups, creating a pipeline for innovation. I'll help existing businesses adapt in order to reach more customers online, which we all know is critical in a post-COVID-19 economy. And I'll invest in programs that truly prepare our children for a changing economy, innovative programs that ensure our kids are getting the types of skills they need to succeed. I'll increase teacher pay and properly fund our public schools. And as we dig our way out of this recession, Missouri simply cannot continue to plod along as jobs keep disappearing and our young people leave the state. It's time for a new way for Missouri. We can't go back to where we were on the eve of this crisis because where we were just wasn't good enough for too many people. As your state auditor, I have never settled for the way things being just the way they are. As your governor, I won't settle either. And together we can make Missouri the best place in America to start a business, to put down roots, and to raise a family. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here this afternoon. Thank you for having me. And I know that y'all might have some questions that you want to ask, so I want to ensure that I leave enough time for that. Oh, Steve, you're on mute.
I said, thank you very much. I know you probably have a busy schedule, seeing as how the virtual convention in Missouri is going on started today. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have a number of questions, both from our MOPEG members, and we may have some chat questions as well. So first question. Governor Parson commissioned a $2.7 million McKinsey study with recommendations on improvement of the Medicaid program in Missouri. These recommendations have not been taken up. What can be done to restructure Medicaid to make it more cost-effective and improve quality and access? Are you committed to implementing some of the recommendations?
So my understanding is that actually Governor Greitens commissioned an independent study of Missouri's Medicaid program, and it did cost more than $2 million. I also am under the impression, just as whoever asked that question mentioned, that most, if not all, of those recommendations have not been implemented. As state auditor, I look for efficiencies in programs all of the time. Medicaid is no different. And so the first thing that I would do is look back at the recommendations that we have made from the auditor's office over a period of time and ensure that those are implemented and working as they should. So that's number one. Number two, a lot of what was in that consultant report, the way that they found ways to save money was to decrease reimbursements and I think decrease services. And as part of looking at the efficiency of Medicaid, we cannot go down a path where we are not allowing people access to health care. I mean, that's what it's all about. And we know that Parson, instead of implementing these recommendations, instead he kicked 100,000 kids off of their health insurance from Medicaid. Instead of doing the hard work and making the program better, he just kicked eligible kids off. That is not right. And so, you know, the purpose of the Medicaid program is to ensure that people have access to the care that they need. But one thing that I will mention, I mentioned this in my remarks a little bit, is that we didn't have to commission a $2.7 million study to know that Medicaid expansion would result in huge budget savings in Missouri's budget. In fact, we could have expanded it when we should have 6 or 7 years ago. Our healthcare budget would be in a better shape than it is today. But unfortunately, in Jefferson City, politics gets in the way. And so, you know, no one disagrees that Medicaid is a significant part of Missouri's budget and that our budget is headed for a challenging road ahead because of the economic consequences of COVID-19. But that's why I support Medicaid expansion. And I think this is the year that we are going to get it done.
Okay, well, I hope we do. We're going to put a plug in for Medicaid expansion coming up on the ballot in August. Another question we had was energy efficiency is one way of addressing climate change. Do you favor adopting statewide energy efficient building codes in Missouri? This is something that was done in St. Louis County within the past year or so.
My understanding, and this building codes and statewide standards for building codes, I will be honest, is not an area that I have a great deal of expertise. My understanding is a lot of that is done at the local level in St. Louis City and St. Louis County and Boone County and Jackson County, because those are the folks that are actually going to do those inspections, ensure that those codes are working as they should. But, you know, taking a step back, I mean, certainly I believe that global warming is real. I believe in science. I believe in listening to experts when it comes to how to deal with these types of challenges. And while much can be done at the local and the state level, I do believe to adequately address the problems in front of us when it comes to climate change, that we need a broader national strategy. And I would do whatever I could to work with our national delegation, as well as looking at how things can be implemented statewide.
Okay. What reforms should be looked at with respect to policing in Missouri?
Yeah, and you know, so I didn't say this in my remarks because I assumed this question would come about. And, you know, first, I think you cannot fix what you do not recognize. And we know that the killing of George Floyd has opened up very painful wounds that we have here in Missouri when it comes to a fractured criminal justice system. There's just no doubt about that. And we are very familiar with this here in Missouri. And what I see from the protests, what I see from young people, old people, Black people, brown, white people taking to the streets saying, we want change. I mean, we want change. And they're giving voice to an energy and a frustration. I do believe that change is coming. What type of change? I think that we're all having that conversation to figure out what can be done tangibly through policy at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. You know, when I hear, and I'll just say this out there, you know, when I hear defund the police or disarm the police or decommission the police or disband the police, you know, I don't support defunding the police. What I hear in people saying that is that they want to address the systemic issues that exist throughout our institutions, and like access to health care, access to a good education, access to a good job, access to mental health care, early childhood education, all of these things that impact people's lives, give them economic opportunity, give them economic empowerment. So folks are not interacting with police downstream. I absolutely understand that motivation. And I do believe that every level of government has to work towards that. That also includes police reforms and certain types of police reforms. And as I said, I think that there's a great discussion happening on what tangible things can happen at each level of government, from federal to state and also to local, because each level bears responsibility here.
In what areas do you think bipartisan legislation is likely? Where it's not likely or can't be achieved, what powers do you have as governor to nevertheless move forward? Are there specific examples of what you want to do where you would have that power as governor?
Well, I think let me take that question a little bit more broadly, because, I have been in Jefferson City as state auditor for 5 years now. I have served under 3 different governors in 5 years, if you can believe it, and governors of both parties. And in my time as state auditor, I have passed 10 pieces of legislation and have had that legislation signed by all 3 governors, again, of different parties. And so you can find your partners on the other side of the aisle and get good things done. You can accomplish something and get things done. I point out that this is not necessarily all about party. Governor Parson was in the legislature for about 16 years. And I have passed more pieces of legislation in my 5 years as state auditor than he did as 16 years in Jefferson City as a legislator. So part of it is working hard to be effective, develop relationships, get results, and find the partners that you need on the other side of the aisle to get things done. Again, it's not necessarily about party. I believe it's about effectiveness, and I have that track record. On the flip side of this here, as governor, I can veto bad legislation that is going to hurt working families, that's going to put Missouri behind. I mean, right to work is a great example of this. Governor Parson has said that if right to work comes to his desk from the legislature, he's going to sign it. Even though, over 60% of voters said no to right to work, he would sign it. I would veto it. And then I would barnstorm the state, traveling to every corner of our state, showing why I'm fighting for working families to help the legislature sustain that veto. So, it's goes both ways as governor. Find your advocates, find folks, be effective, stop bad things from happening.
Okay, what role do you think charter schools should play in Missouri?
I understand why charter schools exist in St. Louis and in Kansas City, because those school districts were not accredited for some period of time. But I support our public schools. I believe accredited, accountable, and fully resourced public schools are the best option for our kids. With teachers that pay a wage that values the work that they do, this must be our goal. I do not support diverting public dollars to private schools. And when it comes to charter schools, as auditor, I have had the opportunity to look under the hood of some of our charter schools, and there hasn't always been positive reviews. Charter schools need to function with stability and with accountability. Unfortunately, what I have found in my work as auditor is that charter schools will come about. They have, hardworking folks that want to do, they are trying to fulfill the mission of education. It doesn't work out for whatever reason, either mismanagement, financial reasons, low performance within the district or within their students. And 5 years later, or even sometimes in a shorter period of that, they close their doors. that leaves children without stable schooling. It leaves families scrambling to try to find a place for their children, an education for their children. And I just truly believe that folks and kids need more stability than that. They need a long relationship with a stable environment in schools. I have 3 kids that are 8, 6, and 3. And so I really do understand that. Look, education unlocks opportunity for every single Missouri child. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And access to a good education is a competitive advantage that's going to pay off well after any term in government that I serve. It's just so incredibly important to support our public schools.
You have said that you would put a renewed focus on job creation outside of the 4 largest counties. Could you be more specific on what could be done there?
Sure. And, you know, one thing, again, I might sound like a broken record, but I do think that it is worth saying, and maybe you're going to get into this in your next conversation. But Medicaid expansion is a big part of this. A new study that came out earlier this week quantified the economic impact of Medicaid expansion. An average of 16,000 new jobs per year over a 5-year period, and 2/3 of them would be outside of our 2 largest metro areas in St. Louis and Kansas City. Think about that. 90% pay of $15 or more, and over $1 billion increase in personal income. This might be the best economic development program that rural Missouri has ever seen, because we're going to be bringing back into our state $1.8 billion of our tax dollars that we send to Jefferson City, bring it here to invest in good jobs throughout our state to help keep our rural hospitals open and to expand access to health care across our state. Again, that's 16,000 new jobs per year over a 5-year period, with 2/3 of them outside of our largest metro areas. If I could deliver that to you, I mean, if I could deliver that for the state of Missouri, of course you would say Medicaid expansion is one of the biggest economic development opportunities we absolutely have. And it's not surprising why the Missouri Chamber of Commerce is supporting this, supporting Medicaid expansion. But I do think it goes beyond that, right? A lack of broadband, a lack of education funding. You might know that more and more of our school districts are going down to 4-day school weeks because they cannot afford to keep the light on that 5th day. They can't run the buses that 5th day. We are missing an opportunity to educate our children. And I'll tell you, a focus on divisive social issues in Jefferson City are holding out-of-state Missouri back, just holding us back. Because companies want to locate in places where they have a ready, educated, skilled, and trained workforce. And our disinvestment in our outstate schools will do lasting damage to our job creation. We have to stop this slide backwards that we've been on in Missouri for such a long time.
Well, I guess that brings us to the next question. How will you help us restore education funding after the cuts we're seeing this year and next?
Yeah, there is no doubt that we are in a tough budget situation, as I have described, due to the economic impacts of COVID-19. Years of bad decisions and irresponsible decisions by Republicans in Jefferson City have led us to this place. Budgets are about priorities. And as Republicans and the governor have cut and given away to special interests, it limits our ability to invest in our children and invest in education, plain and simple. And I'll take a step back here. Years ago, just to give you an example, the legislature passed a bill that would change the way corporations recognize interstate sales. It sounds very boring, I know. But what it did The fiscal note on that piece of legislation was over 700% off, and it ended up impacting our revenues by about $600 million. $600 million that the legislature was not expecting cut from our budget over time. And so there's no wonder we can't properly fund our schools and give teachers a pay raise that they need. And so, as I said, a lot of this is about priorities. Additionally, I have been blowing the whistle for years, that the legislature and the governor, under Republican leadership again, has not conservatively budgeted and created a rainy day fund. So when bad economic times come, we don't have to severely cut education, investments in infrastructure, higher education, on and on. And I have been pleading with the Republicans in Jefferson City to truly be conservative and save for a rainy day. That has led us to where we are right now, where we saw those cuts to education. I would look elsewhere to cut in the budget and do everything that I could to protect K through 12 education. Again, to sound like a broken record, Medicaid expansion is a huge part of this because it has a short-term and long-term positive impact on our state revenues to allow us to focus on other priorities such as education.
I'm going to ask Susan Turk if we've got any chat questions that have come up.
Hi. Actually, we only have, we have 2 chat questions. And so if anybody else wants to ask one, you can open your chat box on the lower hand right of your Zoom screen and type something to everyone, and I'll see it and read it. The first question I have from Ron Zager is, can you find a job for Senator Scott Sifton in your administration?
I love Senator Sifton. Scott is fantastic, and I am not happy that he is terming out in Jefferson City because he is incredibly effective there. And you have Doug Beck-Shirk on, yes. And so remember, because Doug Beck, a state rep, is running for Scott Sifton's Senate seat. And so please support Doug Beck so we have another good advocate in the Senate for us.
Yeah. Another question I have is, what is your stance on LGBTQ rights?
I support.
That's from Bonnie Moore.
Sure. And this will have to be my last question because I have another digital meeting that I have to get to in just a second. I fully support LGBTQ plus rights. We should pass MONA. It is about dang time. It has been proposed in Jefferson City for 23 years. We need to get this done. It is ridiculous that you can be fired, you can lose your housing accommodations, and be discriminated against because of who you are and who you love. I mean, truly, it is just time that Missouri get with the program and get this done. Interestingly, we had because this is Pride Month in June, we had a town hall, an LGBT issue-focused town hall, and you can check that out on my Facebook page. We had a great conversation with Representative Greg Grazer and Ian Mackey out of St. Louis. So again, thank you all for your time. Thank you for letting me visit with you virtually. And I hope that next time it is in person, that we're able to do things in person again very soon. Thank you for your support. You can go to NicoleGalloway.com and get a lot more information about me, about the campaign, see some of the town halls that we've done on LGBTQ plus rights, on healthcare, on health disparities for Black Missourians, the other things that we're covering and talking about. Thank you so much. You all take care and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you.
Our panel will begin shortly.
So I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, Ross.
I sent a question to the chat, and my question appeared in my chat box before anything else was in the chat box. But I'm guessing that you never saw it, Susan. Is that right? About capital gains taxes?
No, I didn't have a question about that.
Well, but I mean, I put that in the chat, and I was the first one in the chat.
I
but
didn't
it
see
never
that.
showed up.
No, you may, I don't know why, but I did not see your question.
How do you make your chat visible? I wrote to everyone, but I'm guessing that nobody probably saw it.
Yeah, if you did you hit enter after you wrote your message?
Oh, no, I didn't hit enter.
Then it did not get sent. When you type in a chat question, at the end, when you're finished typing, you have to hit enter. Otherwise, it will be lost. Did you hear me, Ross? Ross is muted. Well, that's an instruction to everyone.
Okay, well, that's Don Logue, you need to unmute yourself. Well, you don't have to actually, but at this point, but
yeah, I was just cutting down on the background noise. So
that's fine. You can mute yourself. So okay, I think we're ready to go with our panel at this point.
Oh no.
Did I miss something signing in late or
No, you didn't, Don. We're going to go on to the next section now.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So
okay.
About the present state of our country in Missouri. The past 40 years or more have seen the growth of huge income and wealth inequality in the United States. We've seen many changes in our political system and how markets are regulated, which over time have hurt our democracy, increased social injustice, and made it harder for the average family to just live a decent life. This is especially true for minorities. The goal of the next hour is to examine how changes in how capitalism works, what Professor Stiglitz calls progressive capitalism, can provide greater economic security for Missourians. Economic security includes many things, of course, besides simply a good job and income. For example, the ability to access affordable health care, get a good education, and freedom from excessive debt. So this is how the next hour is going to work. Professor Stiglitz will start our panel off, and he will be followed in turn by each panelist. You can submit questions in chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will plan to get to as many as we can. Now, a brief word about our panelists. We're delighted that Professor Joseph Stiglitz is with us today. He is the recipient of the highest honors in his profession, to include the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he has chaired the Council of Economic Advisors and was also chief economist for the World Bank. He is the author of several books, including the recent People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. He has been an advocate for the economically and politically disadvantaged throughout his career. Amy Blouin is founder and CEO of the Missouri Budget Project, an organization widely recognized as a source for objective public policy analysis. She has won regional and state awards for her work. Glen Koenen is past chair of West County Democrats and is a frequent testifier before Jeff City legislative committees. Glen is a member of the Missouri Progressive Action Group. Don Logue has 3 decades of experience advising public and private organizations on community development and healthcare. He has been active in Ferguson community affairs, to include Ella Jones' recent election to mayor. Don is also a member of MOPAG. I would now like to ask Professor Stiglitz to lead off our panel on progressive capitalism.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts with you.
Is
I
your
work
audio
in
working?
Missouri.
Steve, I couldn't hear after you said Don Logue.
What's wrong, Susan? Susan?
Yeah,
Can't hear you.
Yes, Joseph Stiglitz is speaking now.
okay, we're gonna have to mute
Can everyone
everyone.
else hear you?
Yes, and I'm muting you, Linda.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we're ready to go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I wish I could be out there in Missouri. The title "Progressive Capitalism" is sometimes thought to be an oxymoron. How can you have progressive capitalism? But I think that's wrong. In any well-functioning modern economy with the complexity that a modern economy entails, there's going to have to be an important role for markets, for firms, for capitalism. But we have to have a balance between markets, government, and civil society. And what progressive capitalism recognizes is that we've lost that balance, that we denigrated the role of government for 40 years, so that today we were ill prepared for addressing the challenge of COVID-19. And we have a number of other maladies that I'll describe shortly. What's remarkable is that at the same time that we were undermining the role of the state, we actually undermined the effectiveness of our private sector. So I want to briefly go through some of the historical perspective of the last 40 years and describe what went wrong, not only in the United States, but in many other countries, and how we can fix it. Obviously, to do that in 10 minutes, I'm going to be just sketching the arguments. But 40 years ago, when the influence of Reagan, we lowered taxes, particularly at the top. We engaged in deregulation. The idea was that this was supposed to lead to faster economic growth, so much faster that everybody would be better off, even those at the bottom, and even if inequality increased. The problem was that inequality increased far more than anybody anticipated, and growth actually slowed. It didn't lead to faster growth, it led to slower growth, markedly slower, about 1/3 slower than had been the case in the decades after World War II. The deregulation, of course, has had other effects. It has led to a more unstable economy, a dirtier economy. But the two together, lower taxes, particularly for the rich and the corporations, and deregulation, has led to an economy that basically serves only the top 1% or the top 1/10 of 1%. There's been stagnation for most of the rest. The environment has been weakened. And as I said, it has left us ill-prepared for the challenge posed by COVID-19. There are a lot of discussions about making US number one, and it did make us number one, but in many areas that we wouldn't want to be number one. We are the country with the highest level of inequality among all the advanced countries. It worked hard, but after 40 years, we achieved this. We have one of the lowest levels of equality of opportunity. The American dream is a myth. The life prospects of a young American are more determined by the education and income of his parents than in almost any of the other advanced countries. We've achieved the distinction of being the advanced country with the shortest life expectancy and the greatest levels of health inequalities. Not only that, we are one of the few countries where today life expectancy, even before COVID-19, was lower than it was in 2016. We often hear from the president that we had a great economy before the pandemic. That was not true, unless you were in the top 1/10 of 1% or 1%. Then it was a good economy for you. The stock market was doing well. But for the bottom 90%, wages had largely stagnated. Again, another achievement of the administration was the largest peacetime deficit ever for a country not in a recession. Before COVID-19, it was expected that we would have a $1 trillion deficit. With COVID-19, we're now expecting a record deficit of 18 to 20% of GDP, almost more than 3 times of what was the case before. And we've had huge racial disparities in every one of these dimensions: income, health, and prison incarceration. Again, the United States is number 1 by a long measure among democratic countries in the fraction of the population in prison, and it is disproportionately African American. So what do we need? What we need, I think, is a new social contract. I call it progressive capitalism to recall the progressive movement at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where once before we had very high levels of inequality. The progressive movement, and I'll come back to this in a second, was both an economic movement, but it was also a political movement. There was a concern then of high levels of economic concentration, market power, monopolies. And that is what characterizes the American economy today. Large mega firms are one of the reasons that we have such inequality. And we know about the monopolies that we see every day in terms of the tech companies, but we don't realize that these kinds of concentration occur throughout our economy in things like drugstores, dog food, sector after sector has become monopolized. And at the same time that monopoly gives these corporations the power to raise prices, we've also weakened worker power. So that imbalance is one of the reasons why workers are not doing very well. And corporations have misused that kind of power that they have to engage in things like scheduling, split scheduling, all kinds of things that make life so difficult for ordinary Americans. So part of the progressive capitalism part of this restoring the balance is having better rules of the game, a more competitive economy, a cleaner economy where you have regulations against pollution that causes lives. But it's also about ensuring the basics of a decent standard of living. A recommitment that we made after World War II, we made a commitment to full employment with jobs paying livable wages, but then we forgot about it. And we need, again, a recommitment to full employment with all jobs paying livable wages. At the bottom in the United States, the minimum wage today is the same as it was 60 some years ago. Can you imagine an economy that says it's doing well, that has not given a pay raise, in more than 60 years for the people. Many of these are frontline people who are serving us every day, and we seem so important in COVID-19. We are a rich country, but we are a rich country with poor people, and we are a rich country where we don't have access to health and education, social protection, things that other advanced countries take for granted. Many of our citizens don't have. And we see in this current COVID-19 some of the consequences. The United States is about the only advanced country that doesn't require paid sick leave. It was very important in this COVID-19 to make sure that sick people don't go to work. And our Congress did pass a provision mandating paid sick leave for only COVID-19, so only if you have the disease, but they paid because they didn't want people who were sick going to work. But then our richest corporations weighed in Congress and said, we need to be exempt. They were selfish, short-sighted, and inhumane. And with half of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, if you are sick and you don't have paid sick leave, you go to work. And so the corporations with more than 500 employees, almost 50% of all workers were exempted from this mandatory paid sick leave. I've talked very briefly about some of the economic reforms, the new rules, new regulations, the access to health, education, jobs. I want to just end on talking about the importance of the democratic reforms. And by the democratic, I suppose I mean both small d and big D democratic. The fact is that the agenda that I talked about is one that is supported by the vast majority of Americans, I think, throughout the country. We can afford it. But that's why the opposition has been systematically engaged in a process of disenfranchisement, disempowerment, putting democracy in chains. And it goes through everything from voter suppression to gerrymandering, something you know about, to a Supreme Court that is trying to frustrate the will of Americans in a peculiar interpretation of our Constitution. Fundamentally, we have understood since the Enlightenment the principles of what make for a good democracy: separation of powers, checks and balances. But you can't have checks and balances if you have outsized inequalities. Somehow, in one way or another, inequalities of wealth and income will be translated into political inequalities. And we've seen that over and over again. And that's why, to me, it seems to me very important that we address the economic inequalities, both for themselves, because we're concerned about the nature of our society, we're concerned about all parts of our society, but also protect our democracy. Because I don't think we'll be able to protect our democracy if we continue with the outsized inequalities.
Stop leaning on me.
Bonnie, can you mute yourself, please?
Oh,
I was just ending anyway.
Did you get yourself muted?
yep.
So I hope these remarks are helpful in beginning the panel discussion that we're supposed to have now. So I just touched on a large number of topics, but I assume we'll go into some of the more concrete aspects as we go along.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Amy?
Yes, hi everybody. It's good to see you all today and enjoying this conversation. This has been really exciting for me, so I'm happy to be with you. So I was asked to talk a little bit about how the state budget impacts what Professor Stiglitz discussed. And obviously both the state budget and the federal budget and state tax policy as well as federal tax policy have a tremendous impact. And you all know this, you've had me there before to talk with you all, and I've really appreciated your time. But I think as Professor Stiglitz said, the COVID pandemic and the resulting economic crisis can show us very clearly why the state budget matters. How we invest in the safety net, how we invest in critical public services makes a big difference in how our families can overcome the crisis and how our economy can also recover. So it's a few data points, right? Since the COVID crisis hit Missouri in March, we've had more than 591,000 Missourians lose their jobs and file for unemployment assistance. That's 1 in 5 of our workers in the state. As the workers have faced job losses, many of whom cannot sustain a loss of employment because they're living paycheck to paycheck. We've had a shift of folks, or an increase of folks, relying on the safety net. So 75,000 additional folks are receiving Medicaid assistance today as compared to March. 100,000 additional folks are receiving SNAP food assistance today as compared to March. Both of those are 9% increases in the state. TANF and child care assistance are kind of slowly creeping up, but not as quickly as Medicaid and SNAP and unemployment. It's important to recognize that the impact has also fallen disproportionately on African Americans who face both the increased risk of COVID infection and death, serious consequences of COVID, but who also have had disproportionate job loss. So nationwide, the unemployment rate has increased to 14%. The unemployment rate among Black workers has increased to 16.7%. Our frontline workers who are also face the high risk of COVID, face low wages, often don't have health insurance provided or other benefits, and yet make too much for Medicaid assistance in Missouri because our Medicaid level is so low. So, what do we do about this? There are some obvious things that we can do as a state to invest in the services that can help our families succeed, but also help our economy thrive. Auditor Galloway talked already about Medicaid expansion, which is coming to the ballot August 4th. That will have a significant impact. Our current rate, just to remind everybody, eligibility limits stop for parents at 21% of the poverty level. That's the lowest in the nation and well below the national average of 138% of poverty. That means a family of 3 with a mom and 2 kids can't make more than $385 per month and qualify for health care assistance in Missouri. Child care, we also rate incredibly low for child care assistance, 45th in the nation. Unemployment isn't available to all workers in the state. That's something we need to fix, and that's actually common nationally, that unemployment isn't available to all workers typically. In fact, the Congress passed pandemic related unemployment insurance to try to capture some of those workers. But we ought to have that available regularly. We ought to be capturing all workers, workers in the service industry, workers who aren't traditional in the sense to access unemployment. Tax policy can also exacerbate what we face, not only because our tax policy impacts our ability to invest in services, but also because it impacts our individuals in poverty and high wealth individuals differently. There's a disproportionate impact with our tax policy. Sales taxes, for instance, are much more regressive than income tax. We've got a couple of things happening in Missouri related to tax policy specifically that are coming up. One thing we ought to do very quickly is stop the implementation of the 2014 tax cuts, which largely benefit the wealthiest Missourians, but will cost everybody in the sense of our disinvestment in services. Those will cost $720 million per year when they're fully implemented. And they have not been, they've only been halfway implemented. So we still have time to impact that. And one of the things that we've seen happen is that as state tax reductions and state investments in services have been reduced, local sales taxes have been increased to offset that loss. And the local sales taxes then place a greater burden on folks the lower your income is. So it just kind of exacerbates the problems that Missourians face. We also immediately could use federal fiscal relief. You know, our state is going to face significant budget shortfalls, not just in the current year and the coming year, but probably the year after. The fiscal support that the federal government has passed so far in response to COVID has been very restricted. It is not flexible funding. Only about 15% of it can be used to support our ongoing budget needs. Most of it has to go to new expenses related to the COVID pandemic directly. And, you know, it's very unusual that in this pandemic, the Congress passed restrictions on that funding. In the last recession, in the Great Recession, the funding that Missouri received was totally flexible. So if we want to be able to prevent cuts to education, to social services, to child welfare, all of which impact jobs in the state, you know, whether it's teachers or child welfare workers or social workers, or groceries stores that benefit from the sale or the use of SNAP benefits. If we want to support jobs, we need that federal fiscal relief to be enhanced and flexible. So those are my top priorities. I'll stop there. I know, Steve, you just wanted me to talk for a few minutes. We can move to Glenn.
Thank you, Amy.
You bet.
Glenn?
I'm old enough to remember when Missouri used to be jokingly called the middle of the country. We were the middle of the country geographically, we were the middle of the country economically, and as far as our economic performance, we were in the middle. We had numerous Fortune 500 companies in St. Louis and Kansas City, and we've given a lot of that up. I've worked a lot with nonprofits running charities. The two words I hate to hear the most are compassionate conservative. Compassionate conservatism, that whole idea going back to Bush and before that to Reagan, has been a disaster in Missouri. What we've seen is a major abandonment of the public responsibility for government to provide the safety net, to this idea that, oh, the charities will pick up the slack. The problem is, in a lot of places, you do not have that option. Right now, for example, in the state of Missouri, our median household income is about $5,500 a year below the national median income. Yet we have counties in Missouri, and rural counties, where the median household income is under $30,000 a year. I came across a gentleman last year. He was driving 30 miles one way to work a shift at a McDonald's restaurant for minimum wage in Southwest Missouri. I was talking to a lady who runs a food pantry down in the Missouri Ozarks, where their big thing is tourism. And even though she runs a food pantry and she's a retired nurse, she was hoping the governor would lift all the restrictions due to COVID-19 because nobody down there has any jobs because there are no tourists. And because they didn't have their employment quarters in prior to March, they're not getting unemployment. They're out of work and they're getting nothing. What we've seen in Missouri all up and down across the board is this idea that we don't have to do things anymore. We'll let people take care of themselves. We're the laissez-faire state. And we've seen that in everything from food stamp applications. You no longer go into an office and meet with a human being. You have to dial into a call center. And they're doing better now, but we had times when it was a 40-minute wait for your call to even get answered by the computer, which asked you 25 stupid questions to see where you're going to get directed to. So we're in a situation now where we're having to undo the damage we've inflicted upon ourselves. You may have heard we have what's called the Hancock Amendment from back in the 1980s, which limited our state's ability to bring in revenue. If we bring in too much revenue, we have to refund it, not to everybody who pays taxes, but refund it to individual income tax recipients. Because of that, Missouri keeps tightening down what it collects. The end result is that Auditor Galloway has found that we're about $4 billion a year on a $10 billion general revenue budget, below where we could be with money for things like education and medical care. So our problem is now you go out and you talk to people and they are convinced that Missouri has more than enough money. The problem is lazy people who don't want to work, bureaucrats who don't do their job, and people who don't want to do anything for themselves. And things are going great. And if they're not going great, you just need a second or third or fourth job. One thing that really scares me is talking to people around the state is that even among our Democrats, expectations have been lowered. We no longer talk about what we should be doing. We no longer talk about what we could be doing. We talk about what do we have to stop? What next bad thing coming down the pike do we have to draw the line in the sand and have our senators filibuster and things like that? Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Glenn. Don Logue?
Yes, okay. Please pin my image, if you would, if you could see that picture that I've got up.
We can see it.
Okay, so that's significant to what I have to say. First, I want to compliment Professor Stiglitz on an extraordinary work. And of course, that's just one more in a whole series of extraordinary efforts that he's put forth. You know, for me, it was somewhat a trip through time because I began my political experience in 1979, that 40-year or so point that he talks about. And I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly at the local level, at the national level in my visits to Capitol Hill, and also internationally in visits to some of those countries that he works with in Europe, but also with some of the developing countries in Latin America. So I grew up in rural America in a community of 3,000, once characterized in the Chicago Tribune as the town that refused to disappear. From that, I learned a sense of community cited by Tocqueville in his book on America in the early 19th century as one of our great strengths. And so today, Hillary Clinton used this phrase, but it actually comes, as I understand it, from it's part of cultural heritage in Africa. It takes a village to raise our children. And in many respects, I think that the book, People, Power, and Politics, is in part a detailed enunciation of that nurturing environment that we need to create. I've been blessed by many experiences as a student, researcher, local public official, nonprofit executive, business executive, educator, and healthcare provider. But the culmination of my work is seen in this picture on the screen right now. On April 2nd, Ella Jones was elected to become the new mayor of Ferguson, Missouri. I've been blessed to know her as a friend and work with her as a member of her team for 5 years to bring North St. Louis County communities to the table. And I think is in the close of Professor Stiglitz's book, he talks about politics being our greatest challenge. I hope I'm getting that correct. In spite of what our current president tells us about how all of our problems are going to be solved quickly and easily, I know better from 40 years of work at different levels. And leadership that understands our challenges is critical. And that's why you see in this picture, you see the author, Corinne Jean-Pierre, who has an extraordinary story of how she has worked through challenges, the daughter of Haitian immigrants. You see Ella Jones next to her, who fought for 5 years to overcome the community challenges in Ferguson. Sharon Pace, who has been a leader in the legislature and community and is one of our nonprofit executives that drives a lot of our nonprofit work in North County. And Shirley Emerson, who works both on the staffs of the Brown School professors and professors over at Harris Stowe. Now, I'm in the back in a support role, but I think it's important that we're looking at 4 Black women who are leading the cause for many of the issues that Professor Stiglitz has espoused. So I don't want to go too much further. I could tell lots of stories, but it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. We're talking about culture change here, and hopefully Galloway will be our new governor, but it's going to be a tough fight, and it's going to be a fight not just between the parties, but it's also a fight among all the different stakeholders that refuse to embrace the necessary change that needs to take place to make that budget an effective tool. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll have some good questions.
Okay, thank you, Don. Part of me wants to go broad view, and part of me wants to drill down more into some specific issues. Since we have Joseph Stiglitz with us today, I'd like to ask him some specific questions about some topics that are widely talked about today within the progressive movement. So one of the things affecting economic security is certainly student debt. Student debt today totals about $1.5 trillion nationwide. Missouri borrowers owe about $34,000 each in student debt. And student loan debt, in fact, is the second highest consumer debt category behind mortgage debt. So there was a lot of talk during the Democratic primaries about forgiving student loan debt. How should we deal with student debt, and how do we curb the problem going forward?
Yeah, let me first begin by talking about the real challenge, which is dealing with it going forward. We are one of the few countries that makes access to higher education so dependent on money, on your ability of your parents or you to pay. Other countries, not as rich as the United States, have much lower tuition. And tuition in the United States has increased enormously, especially in state schools. After the 2008 crisis, there were cutbacks in many states that forced an increase in tuition. there are two models. The European model, which is low tuition. The other one is an Australian model where they have an income contingent loan program where everybody gets a loan, but the amount they repay depends on their income. So it doesn't stop you from becoming a minister, from becoming a primary school teacher, you know, whatever job, your choice of jobs is not going to be constrained. And after 20 years, the debt is forgiven. So basically, it's a system that makes access available to all. I have some preference for that because right now, the budget constraints are so severe that it's going to be hard to pay for lower tuition that will come out of state government revenues. But it seems to me that there should be just an absolute commitment to the principle that education should be accessible to everybody, no matter what the income and wealth of their parents. That should be a first order commitment. Now, the problem you've talked about of student debt is also not only a problem for these individuals, it's affecting their choices, it's affecting their careers. I see it from a lot of our students. It's also having macroeconomic effects. It's stopping people from buying houses, from buying cars. It really is a and I think there needs to be some way of lowering the burden of this debt, perhaps by making some of the debt taken over by the government and the repayment capped at a certain percentage of an individual's income, so that it won't be the burden that it is today. There has to be a way of dealing with the discharge of debt in a way that's equitable. Otherwise, there will be a lot of objections, but it shouldn't be the case that it is the kind of burden that it is today on so many young people.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go on to another issue on healthcare and obesity. There has been a sharp increase in obesity rates in the US over the last decade, with 40% of all adults over the age of 20 now obese. And over the next 10 years, it's supposed to increase further up to about 50%. Among the states, Missouri is one of the worst. We're 8th from the bottom. Isn't obesity a societal concern that goes beyond individual choices? How would or should a progressive capitalism address this problem? And I lob that out to anyone who might want to respond to that. Don?
Yes, I would. Healthcare is one of my specialties. We, in this hollowing out of government that's taken place over the last 40 years, we've shattered our social infrastructure, our social safety net. And as a result, we're seeing an enormous increase in mental health issues. We're undermining education. The combination of those two and criminal justice, is also a factor there because we're incarcerating so many of our citizens because we have the social safety net, the social infrastructure hasn't supported them to adulthood. The obesity is a reflection of a greater problem across the board of our social infrastructure just not being there for people. And suicides are up, particularly for white men without a college education.
Can I add a couple of points to that? I talk about some of these issues in my book. One of them is that the food companies, the soft drink companies, have one objective: making money. And the more addictive the food, the sugar rich, the better. There have been attempts in many places to regulate the sale of these sugar-rich, addictive foods near schools, because the children is where the childhood diabetes problem is a particular vexing problem. And the food companies have done everything they can to stop these initiatives to try to make sure that children are not exposed to these, what I think are, quite frankly, dangerous foods. They're not dangerous in the sense that they're poison, but they lead to childhood diabetes. So I think one thing we need is regulation of the food companies, recognizing that they are causing a social disease. Not quite as obvious as the way the opioid companies, the drug companies push the opioid crisis, but it is, their actions are leading to the childhood diabetes crises. In New York City, our mayor tried to discourage the consumption of calorie-rich big drinks at movie theaters by saying you couldn't sell the big drinks. You could buy two small ones, but you couldn't buy one big one, just to increase the transaction cost, to make it people aware of what they were doing. And the soft drink companies lobbied strongly and succeeded in stopping that initiative. So that's one important part. Secondly, in many parts of the country, I don't know if this is true in Missouri, there are what we call food deserts. Large parts of the country where you cannot get nutritious food. And that should be a public responsibility. If the private sector isn't selling nutritious food, we ought to step in. And again, in New York, the mayor stepped in and made it easier for people to sell fruits and vegetables on street corners. So we now have an active industry. So everybody, and we have farmers market all over the city. So there was an active role of government in promoting access to nutritious food. And I think that should be a national-wide campaign. And that's probably the third aspect. Information, knowledge is really important. And we have to change social norms in this way. And we have to make people aware of the dangers or the benefits of good eating. Let me put it like that. Talk about it on the positive side. We have to make people aware of that nutrition is really important for their physical well-being, for their psychological well-being. And I think we can do that. We can restrict the bad behavior and we can encourage the good behavior.
In Missouri, we have a lot of areas where they don't have the good food supply because it's primarily low-income people. Having run food pantries, you learn very quickly, calories are cheap, nutrition is expensive. I ran a food pantry, we spent $5,000 a week on things like milk, eggs, frozen meat, and a lot of fresh produce. Under the food stamp rules a couple years ago, to accept food stamps, you're supposed to have so many fresh food items in the store. We now have gas station convenience stores that have like 3 apples, 3 oranges, 3 bananas, and a couple of other things, and they're being allowed by the state of Missouri to still accept food stamps. Because yes, they have fresh food, but they don't have fresh food in the quantity or the type of foods. And also at $1.19 for banana, no mom with 3 kids can go in and afford to buy fruit at the Quick Trip.
So to add to that, in Ferguson, we had 1,500 housing units, affordable housing units, clustered, such that their primary location for easy food access was the convenience store that was burned down in the post-Michael Brown death protests. And so again, there's a failure of public policy in, again, situating and housing people in areas, 20% of which households don't have cars, where they have, like Glenn said, this food desert that they have to overcome. Quick Trip is not the best place to go for nutritional food.
Okay. I'd like to ask you all a question about ballot measures, if you'll indulge me. In 2018, voters passed the ballot measure Clean Missouri to do away with gerrymandering. And this August, Medicaid expansion is on the ballot. Is there a ballot measure that should be a high priority in 2022? Would it make sense to have a ballot measure for Missouri to implement an estate tax like 12 other states have, or have an earned income tax credit? Is that something that would be appropriate for a ballot measure? It seems to be that's the way progressives get things done here in Missouri. We have to go to the ballot measure because we know it's not going to pass in Jeff City. So I would just like panelists to give us some views on what might be the next good ballot measure. Anyone?
So I'll take a stab at that. You're right in that a lot of the issues that we care about and want to see passed as voters, we have to go to the voters, right? The legislature, ever since we implemented term limits in the state legislature, has become embroiled in partisanship and does not pass what we need and see as supportive for families. So, the unfortunate part, I think, is that many of these ballot measures are now moving to be constitutional amendments because that's the only way to protect them from the legislators interfering with them after voters pass them. But because of that, I think we have to be somewhat conscientious, at least, about what we put forward as a constitutional amendment, right? It needs to be something that we're okay with being within the Constitution for a long period of time. And I think, Medicaid expansion is a good example of that. We need to get that done. It's something that we can put into the Constitution that is not going to change overnight, right? It's not something that could change next year or the following year. I do think that at some point we need to move forward some tax policy changes, definitely. And I don't know if 2022 is the time to do that or not, but we need, our tax structure has become incredibly flat, our income tax, and we need to update that. One of the things that we've been moving on the state level in the legislature is an earned income tax credit, as you said. We need to revamp our entire income tax structure to update it and make it more progressive. It used to be progressive. You all know this, but because of just inaction over decades, it's become really flat. So I do think that's something we need to address, and it might need to start with eliminating the tax reductions of 2014 too.
Okay.
One thing I'm worried about is that this year on the ballot, we're having to revisit Clean Missouri. In other words, legislation we passed, or a proposal we passed with 62% of the vote, 2 years later, we're having to go in and vote on exactly the same thing again because of the legislature. I think anything with a fiscal note like an EITC is going to be a hard sell in Missouri, as we've seen with gas taxes, tobacco taxes, and so on. I would like to see the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. I think that is something that we can get people to vote for in 22. And if we get them to vote for a few more progressive ideas on social issues, then moving into the taxation issues might be easier.
Don? Oh. I didn't know if you want to say anything, Don, or not.
I would underscore what Amy and Glenn said, but also say that, you know, the real problem here is a crisis of leadership. That obviously that's what our organization is focused upon, because, you know, when we have to do everything by ballot initiative, it becomes a populist process that really shortcuts the ability for effective debate and deliberation on these issues. And so there are dangers there.
Okay, well, Glenn, one of the things you mentioned in a prior meeting was what is widely known, that term limits here in Missouri have been extremely destructive to the function of our state government. And at some point, it might be appropriate to put that on as a ballot measure.
Ironically, people on the other side of the aisle are talking about how do we expand term limits to Congress. And here in Missouri, I think we may have to take a half step, saying 16 years in one house of the state legislature rather than a total of 16 between House and Senate. Because we're getting so many people right now in Jeff City. I was at a hearing 2 years ago where the chairman of the committee didn't realize all the divisions she had to look at. She didn't realize the children's division was part of her committee's mandate. Now it's her third month as chairman.
I'd like to go back to something that Professor Stiglitz touched on and some others, prison incarceration. So huge numbers of people in the US are charged with misdemeanors or non-criminal violations. Rather than investing in community-driven safety initiatives, cities and counties are still pouring vast amounts of public resources into the processing and punishment of minor offenses. In fact, there was an article on NPR today about how the processing and punishment of minor offenses sweeps so many blacks into the criminal system. Should we see this issue as part of the agenda of the nationwide protests to defund police departments? Any comments you have in this area? Anyone?
Yeah, let me say, I think the country's mass incarceration system has enormous economic cost and is inhumane and doesn't succeed in its objective of reducing crime. It's one of those lose-lose policies that costs money and it doesn't succeed in its objectives. It is so expensive that in some states, I don't know Missouri, California was spending more money on penitentiaries than it was spending on expanding the universities. There's a joke that was a university that we were sending many African Americans to, but they were learning about crime, not about how to be more productive. So it is so counterproductive. Other countries have actually in some of the drug areas. Portugal has, what they did is decrease their spending on police, but increase their spending in social work. Increase their spending in the kind of people that would actually deal with the problem. And they have succeeded in reducing the drug cases much more effectively than we have. So when people talk about defunding, what they're talking about is reallocating money to make it a more productive use of our money. And if we did that, we would have fewer incarcerations, more people being productive in our society, and save money.
In Missouri, we're going the opposite direction. They passed a bill this session, which I don't think the governor has signed yet, which even a couple of Republicans admitted could create 2,500 more people to be imprisoned, which would mean 1 to 2 more prisons in Missouri. So we're still doing things the old-fashioned way, despite the fact that we know better.
Yeah, I mean, this is a barbaric ideology that began again back in the late 70s, early 60s, 80s, and it completely abandons the ideals upon which this country was founded upon, and we have to have this battle for the soul in these elections. And call people on the carpet on this, because the per capita murder rate in Missouri is the second highest in the nation. That blood is on the hands of the legislature and the governor. We need to talk in those terms, because the lack of investment is costing lives of all ages in our society in this state.
I'd like to ask Professor Stiglitz in particular, but all the panel as well, what can progressives do to promote a progressive capitalism agenda in the Democratic Party, and in particular with Democratic leadership in Washington?
Well, I think the important part of pushing the progressive agenda is to have a certain clarity about what you want, and draw some lines in compromise. I think part of the problem in the past was it was under Clinton, they call it a triangulation. And one of the questions earlier was about capital gains taxes. One of the mistakes I think he made was to cut capital gains taxes. Why should people who are very well, most of the capital gains go to people at the very top, and capital gains are taxed at a rate much lower than people who work for a living. It makes absolutely no economic sense. When I was in the Clinton administration, I opposed. It was one of the areas where I failed to persuade my colleagues or the president. But I think we now see it as one of the causes of increase of inequality. But that was a kind of compromise of trying to get something done. The kinds of principles I think that almost all Democrats agree on are what the progressives agree on. Livable wages, jobs for everybody, healthcare for everybody, education for everybody. And these are things that make our economy stronger, and we can afford it. It will require increasing taxes on corporations, increasing taxes on capital gains, maybe having a wealth tax. Those would be good things. The corporations are getting excess corporate profits because of their monopolies. And we also should think about some kinds of environmental taxes. We haven't talked about that as part of but I view good environmental policy as part of social justice, both because the adverse environmental effects are borne by the poor, but also it's a question about across generations. Fairness, we don't want to leave the legacy of global warming to our children and grandchildren to have to deal with. So I think a certain clarity of what we want and saying, okay, we believe in compromise, but there are limits on where you compromise.
Well, in speaking about the environment and climate change, so we know the Green New Deal resolution in Congress was modeled after FDR's New Deal. The European Parliament seems supportive of a Euro Green Deal to deal with both the economic destruction of the pandemic and climate change. With all the money, with all the federal expenditures being made for the pandemic, how are we going to fund a massive Green New Deal effort? Carbon tax, bonds?
Well, first, I think we're going to have to spend more money to get out of COVID-19. The recovery program that was designed on the assumption that the whole thing would be over by June 1st or maybe at the latest by July 30th. That looks like a fantasy now, but that was what the program was designed for. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, I think everybody recognizes that we are going to have more funding. Now, when it comes for that time for that additional funding, we should do what a lot of European countries have been doing, putting conditions on the money that we spend.
We don't do a very good job of that. And that's a choice, right?
That's right. The government has never supported this economy to the extent that it has in this COVID-19 crisis. But it's been a bazooka, it's been a fire hose without any thought of what kind of economy we want to emerge after the pandemic. No vision at all. And we don't want to go back to where we were. We want a society with greater equality, better health, greener. So we should make use of our money, the money that is being used to restore the economy, to restore it in a way that's more consistent with our values. So for instance, when France gave money to the airlines, it put a condition. They had to move into more fuel efficient, greener airplanes. They had to, change the way they did business. And we could do that across the board. And that would be a way, with that I would view as part of the Green New Deal. In the second phase, I've been in a lot of conversations with the French government over the last week. In the second, in the recovery programs, there's going to be a lot of investment to stimulate the economy. And as you point out, what they're thinking very hard about is how do they shape those investments to help move the economy in a greener direction. Some of the investments, the green investments, can be very timely, very labor intensive, so they support wages, and have what we call high multipliers, so that for every dollar spending, you stimulate GDP a lot more. So they've been very thoughtful in trying to construct recovery packages that move the economy in the direction of, the Green New Deal was passed before COVID-19. We now have to adapt to COVID-19, but what they're doing is effectively incorporating the objectives of a Green New Deal into their COVID-19 packages.
All right, thank you. So I think we better turn to some of the chat questions that we have. Susan? Susan, are you with us?
I'm with you. I just had to unmute. I think you've probably already discussed this, Professor Stiglitz, but I wanted to make sure that this got in because one of our members, Ross Hunt, has had this question pending. Inequality of income leads to social problems. The argument is often made that corporate capital gains taxes had to be lowered for U.S. corporations to be competitive internationally. But can't individual capital gains taxes be raised significantly, rewarding wage earners over those who passively hold equity wealth?
Oh, absolutely. I also think that the United States can impose a global minimum tax. Corporations who want to operate in the United States, sell in the United States, if they want to do business in the United States, would have to pay this minimum tax. And right now there is a discussion going on internationally about imposing a 25% global minimum corporate income tax. So, and we've been one of the countries that have been recalcitrant and not going along. So if we had the right government in Washington, I believe this kind of idea of stopping the race to the bottom, having a global minimum tax. And if Europe and the United States did that, there wouldn't be any problem, because every company, every large company wants to operate in, wants to sell or produce or both in either Europe or the United States.
My next question comes from, oh dear, wait a second. It's Roger Clausen's question. He'd like to know what you think about Milton Friedman's theory of the role of management to enhance shareholder value.
Yeah, this is, Milton Friedman argued that firms, managers should have a narrow focus and just maximize the shareholder value. And he almost thought it was a sin if they did anything else. I had written a paper before he took up that particular political agenda that was published in two papers published in reputable leading economic journals, where I explained why what he said was totally wrong. But I did it in mathematics, and he did it with political rhetoric, and he was more influential than I was at the moment. The good news is that about September or so, the leaders of the Business Roundtable, which are the largest companies in the United States, 500, came around to the view that I've been arguing for 40 years, 45 years. And they said companies have to pay attention to things other than shareholder value. They need to pay attention to their workers, the customers, the communities, and the environment. Now, the problem is we won the rhetoric now to make sure they actually do that. So they now understand politically they have to say things like that, and some of them actually believe it. And I think part of our jobs as progressives is to help move them so they not only say those words, but they actually behave the way that they say that they believe.
Thank you. Lloyd Kleindienst has asked, what do you think about the thesis that capitalism and democracy are mutually exclusive terms or concepts?
Well, this is what I hinted at in the beginning of my talk when people said, some people said progressive capitalism was an oxymoron, that capitalism and democracy are inconsistent. I think monopoly capitalism is inconsistent with democracy. I think that was why under Theodore Roosevelt, who's a Republican, they passed antitrust laws to break up the monopolies, because that does undermine democracy. If you have these concentrations of power, whether it's wealth concentrations or market concentrations, they're going to shape our politics. And things are in some ways worse than they were when Roosevelt was the president because of the Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United. We said corporations are people and have the right to unlimited spending. So today, the threat of money and power to our democracy is greater than it was 100 years ago. So a competitive, decentralized market economy, kind of capitalism, but it's the kind of progressive capitalism that I described, is one I think that is 100% consistent, in fact, an important part of democracy. But the monopoly capitalism, the concentrations of wealth are a threat to democracy.
Thank you. Christina Anderson would like to know if you can name a few politicians or elected officials that you like, and do you follow any politician or elected official?
No, I don't spend much time on social media. I guess you have to run your life either whether you write and engage and talk conversations or whether you're on social media. It's hard to do everything. so I don't engage in. I think right now we're blessed with a lot of good political leaders in the Democratic Party. I think you look at the array of people. I don't know what feeling you have, but when I saw those primaries, you listen to the speeches, there were just an awful lot of good people out there with good ideas and people who really have a good heart. People who are whose values I agree with and who are really motivated because of concern for our country's problems and trying to make the lives of Americans better.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from State Representative Sarah Unsiger. And this is probably to the other panelists, how do we help people apply for Medicaid when kids aren't in school and people are avoiding going to social service providers, which is usually where they get help applying? Medicaid applications were down in April, and I'm willing to bet they were down in May too. Amy, Glenn, Don?
I can start with that. One problem is you have to remember, we've been dismantling the Department of Social Services now since the baby Blouin administration. We've gone from an office in every county to call centers, and that's making it much harder. A lot of things we're just going to have to invest in people, and the Department of Social Services is going to expand their footprint. They're going to have to do outreach. They're going to have to do outreach in areas where we know there are large concentrations of eligible families. They're going to have to make their forms simpler. If you've ever read a letter from the Department of Social Services and you can understand it, give yourself an A. They don't use English as their native language. It's bureaucratic, and very often it's a form letter generated by the computer with absolutely no input from a human being once something is coded in the system. So unfortunately, we need to make a commitment to people and money and outreach so we can get the help to the people where they can apply.
So I'll build on what Glenn said just for a minute. We all know and remember that we had a significant problem with Medicaid enrollment and Medicaid enrollment declines because of some changes that the department implemented related to re-enrollments and income verification and so forth. Well, what we've seen during COVID is that a lot of those changes were stopped. So we are not having, the department, for example, stopped doing the quarterly checks on income, stopped eliminating Medicaid coverage for people, stopped requiring the annual reviews of income and annual renewals. So that's actually balanced out the loss that we were seeing, and applications are still coming in. We've had 100,000 more people sign up for Medicaid in the last 3 months. But those applications are being responded to immediately because the department isn't having to do these other more restrictive things that have reduced eligibility over time. They also extended the hours of the call center, which I think helped significantly. They've got weekend hours too, which was not something they were doing before. So I think what we need to do is look at the policy changes that have made improvements with our enrollment system and try to retain those even after we're done with COVID, to make sure that we've got a system that's working to get people enrolled in the services that they need and which they qualify for.
The other thing is our human services bureaucracy in Jefferson City is a train wreck. Okay, we're using 1970s computer programs to deliver these services. And, again, there are a lot of stakeholders that don't want to see changes, okay? And it's going to take very good leadership to walk us through a transition to where we can more effectively spend that money. And as to Glenn's point, meet people where they are. And there are a lot of things happening in technology that can allow us to cost effectively support healthcare, as an example, in our rural communities. We got to have broadband, okay? But that's an investment. That's a capital expenditure. But it's one other third world countries are doing. So we have to address the dysfunction that exists and be willing to have hard food fight discussions with all the different providers and political organizations.
The professor may be interested to know that in Missouri, our food stamp program is still in COBOL processing. And we have, the program they're using was designed as a transitional program during the Clinton administration. And we're going to have some people who are going to spend their entire professional career using that transitional program because the replacement date has gone from 2013 to 2024.
Very interesting.
Okay. Let's see if the next question has to do with if Missouri, if under COVID, Missouri keeps hold of its vote by mail restrictions for November, what can we do to win votes in more conservative parts of the state since Democratic turnout will likely be suppressed? And this is Joshua Hebda's question, everyone. Republican voters support the same sorts of economic reforms that we are discussing here, but they vote for people who do not support those policies. How can we win those votes? Is it possible? Is it worth it? Glenn, Amy, Don, Dr. Stiglitz?
Well, let me make a comment on the second part of the question. I think that's a real problem. If you look at all the issues that people care about, that I've talked about, you know, livable wages, access to healthcare, gun control, you know, prison reform, 2 to 1 they support, or even more, 3 to 1, they support the progressive agenda. And the problem is, as the question pointed out, they often vote for people who don't support those agenda. So I think this is partly a question of information, just trying to say, you know, try to get out the understanding that the reason we don't have livable wages, the reason we don't have access to healthcare is that don't listen to their overall rhetoric that it's going to grow the economy, everybody's going to be better off, that kind of thing. Look what they actually have been supporting. And it began, say, in healthcare with repeal and replace. Now it's just repeal. And millions of more Americans do not have health insurance now than was the case in 2016. And there's no plan at the federal level to make sure that people have access to health care. So, you know, Democrats may disagree about the best way to do it, but there's no disagreement about we will find a way to do it. And just try to make that point very clear.
My polling place has 2,300 voters. The entire population of Worth County, Missouri is about 2,000. The city of St. Louis and the 8 most populous counties have more voters than the other 106 counties combined. So we could be cynical and say, we're going to concentrate on the city of St. Louis and 8 counties, let the rest of them fend for themselves.
So, you know, I actually want to bring up something too. You know, I run a nonprofit. The Missouri Budget Project's a nonprofit 501c3, so I have to be careful what I talk about. But I will say I am concerned about voter suppression and Medicaid expansion. You know, and there are a lot of policy issues going to the ballot, and voter suppression impacts those policy issues too, right? So one of the things that you all know this, I'm sure, but the legislature did is they passed the ability to use the absentee ballot. Anybody can use it, But if you're not sick and you're not in the high risk category, you have to have that notarized still. So folks could look for ways to invest in notaries and make those readily accessible and help people access absentee ballots and get them notarized for free and sent in. And that would have a big impact on Medicaid expansion in August and also other issues in November. I don't know who those folks are who want to do that. And just putting a plug in.
I'll talk a little bit about that later on.
It's great.
At the very end.
So, you know, I grew up in rural America, so I understand the rural-urban divide. And I think we have not effectively focused the political discussion on the common challenges that both urban and rural Missouri citizens both face. I mean, substance abuse is everywhere, okay? The fact our children are now having trouble getting a job, being able to marry and buy a home, that's everybody's problem. And so we need to really focus on a culture change, and it's hard, it's difficult, but we all have to understand we're in the same boat. And you know, that's, you know, the Republican leadership now, it's all about division. Well, we have to do a better job of preaching unity, so, and educating on unity.
Okay, we're already running over our time, so I think we better bring this panel to a close. I hope those watching got some ideas about a path forward. As Professor Stiglitz writes in his book, before there is economic reform, there must be political reform, and I think that's seeing these protests both in the in the U.S. and across the world. I mean, that's part of that political reform, part of that political engagement. So that is a positive sign. And we didn't have time today to even get into a discussion about much of a discussion about that. So anyway, I want to thank all our panelists today, and especially our special guest, Professor Stiglitz, who was kind enough to share his time and insights. If you would like to learn more, I recommend his book, People, Power, and Profits, and also his book, The Great Divide. Some of his works are on hoopladigital.com. You can find them for free. That's, you know, through your library service, you can hook into hoopladigital.com. He also had, Professor Stiglitz also had an eye-opening talk with Robert Reich on YouTube. And we provide that link at the top of the chats, and that will be posted to mopag.net, along with today's video and chat session. There are different groups working to get the vote out to pass Medicaid expansion, of course, on the August ballot. Missouri Jobs with Justice has a video call on Thursday, June 18th at 6 p.m. A link for that was posted at the top of our chat session, and I will also put it out on our website and Facebook and so forth. So you might if want to look into that, or I would coordinate with I would contact League of Women Voters also about supporting voter turnout for August. So thank you again, everyone. Be well, stay safe, take care all.
Can I have one last word, Steve?
Yes.
Just to remind anyone who is new, who would like to hear about future MOPAG meetings, to send your email to us at mopag, MOPAGSTL @gmail.com. We'll put you on our mailing list, and you can be aware of what we're doing. to promote progressive values in Missouri.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Steve, are you going to stop the recording?
Yes, I am.
And want me to